you immediately use net, and then that's the end, right? Because then you say, well, I'm interested in this. And then, because the whole arrangement is to have no common interest.
Very nearly there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is.
It's an anomic.
In 10 seconds. In 5, 4, 3.
Hello, I'm Ian Angus from the Institute for the Humanities at Simon Fraser University. We have a discussion today with John O'Neill to continue our investigation of the theme of conflicting publics. John O'Neill is Distinguished Research Professor in Sociology at York University in Toronto and is currently this year lecturing at Staffordshire University in England. John.
Hello, Ian.
Perhaps we could begin if I ask you about what were your formative intellectual and political experiences. How did you get started being a sociologist and social philosopher?
Well, at the risk of seeming to have always known that answer, because I think a large part of the answer is that I've never quite known why I was doing anything at any particular point. But there are things that when you think about it were defining moments. So I would like to say that one of the things that got me going was not knowing anything at all, but knowing that I didn't know anything at all. I'm the first person educated in my family, and I could see that my father's way of figuring out the world derived largely from newspapers, and overall was a view that we would think of as conspiratorial. Everything happened because they wanted us to this, that, and the other. So it was very important to me when I don't know what the source is, but I read an article about the nature of economic rent. And I could suddenly see that how the collective efforts of people were appropriated by some other group of people. And I knew then that that was called economics. So you needed to learn whatever the rest of that discipline was from which that comes. And I think that's a very important starting place for my sense of socialism. It matched up with the experience of my family. It paid, I would say, in a kind of Freud, now post-Freudian culture, it was knowledge that didn't kill my father. It situated me and my father. Because I would say about my father's ignorance, it was a benign ignorance. We both teach students, many of whom have a hard time with parents who pretend to know better for them. For example, who have wholly utilitarian or money-making senses of what kids should be doing in school, which cuts down on those discovering moments.
So would you say you experienced education and reading and social theory as a kind of a liberation, as a way of understanding the culture and the class from which people came?
Always opening up the world. The other place would be, I'm a Catholic in England, and then when I grew up, to say you're a Catholic was sort of like shutting the lid down on your whole life. But I was not a defiant Catholic or a dumb Catholic. But what was decent about being a dumb Catholic was I would go to Mass, and the point that attracted me was always the homilies. And the homilies and the church itself was another way of situating what I'll call our kitchen. I think I have a notion of the primal scene of theorizing, not being sexual at all, but being familial. So in the kitchen where I grew up, my father was doing the football pools, my mother was making the meals, my sister was washing her hair, and I was trying to study. And so I think that I've always learned to work under those conditions, and the things I've learned have never alienated me from that. They have kind of taken that little world and brought down upon it these larger worlds, but not as alien worlds. So in a sense, this little lost family that James Agee writes about so beautifully in Let Us Now Praise Famous Man, a gorgeous study of some little lost farm crop, sharecropper families, for whom there's no world other than the world they can make for one another. Well, that world, for me, religion gave that first family suddenly a 2,000-year legacy. You know, maybe it was full of crazy things, but it was enlarged. Mm-hmm. The next place was school. School enlarged my world, and especially when I went to grammar school, which enlarged it with languages, Latin, French, but more specifically enlarged it with the thing that the school gets its name from, grammar. Grammar being the idea that you can't just know a word or have an idea. You've got to have it strung together, this to that to the other. So that sense of enlargement, even though I was brought up in a terribly punitive school system, everything I know was beaten into me.
Well, you seem to have learned quite well. Your early work was characterized by a synthesis of phenomenology and Marxism. What was it that attracted you to these intellectual traditions as a way of broadening your horizons?
Well, that's much later on. As I say, being working class doesn't make you necessarily even a labor-type socialist, and being socialist doesn't make you a Marxist. These are all levels of life. But I think the underlying impulse was to know how society works. And whenever it happens to you that you come across a page of Marx, it seems to be telling you that. It seems to be telling you that in such strong ways that that is the Enlightenment. It's not just that historical period, but it's that conviction that, yes, if I'm going to understand what has been happening to us, I'll need to be able to think, speak, write that way. So that there's another story within story about how I actually come to read Marx. After I'm an undergraduate at the LSE, I read Marx in America at the University of Notre Dame, or Notre Dame as I learned to call it, in the mid-50s, when there was no Marxism in North America, and certainly no critical theory. Phenomenology is similarly a late activity. It's after graduate school in the 50s, which was ruled by ordinary language philosophy, that on coming to Canada, and in particular to York in Toronto, there was time to read in one's office. And I was under
which there isn't much of these days.
No. I was under the illusion that Canada was bilingual. So I thought I'd better read something. I read Sartre for a while, and then in the back of my mind was a word. I'm not sure how it got there, but it was Merleau-Ponty. And that was phenomenology. And it's a phenomenology grounded. It grounded reason very deeply in the kind of being that an embodied being is. And that seemed to link up my whole life. One of the things one's supposed to do with philosophy, that was something that Wittgenstein was always saying, was that the point about ordinary language philosophy was that it would release you from the pain and knots of philosophy. I didn't find that ordinary language philosophy did that to me. Its triviality, in fact, seemed to knock me up worse than anything. But phenomenology seemed to do that for me. Once I'd read Merleau-Ponty, I felt that I had gotten things together. By this time, we're into the 60s, when I'm not alone in discovering that we have bodies. Everybody started to have a body in the 60s.
And to enjoy having them.
Yes, and then I'm not sure whether I kept up with all.
Yeah. Well, when I look at your work, I see this emphasis on the body, on emotions, and on the person, which is quite distinctive in sociological thought. It's a rare emphasis, it seems to me, in any case. And do you see your work, in a sense, as going against the grain or going against the mainstream in this respect?
Well, I suppose so. And that may be because at the end of a long life, I have to profess that I'm a professor. And what kind of animal is that? It's probably something that's always going against the grain. So say, with regard to the body, everybody now has a body, as I said, but they seem to want to have lots of them. And they even seem to want to be able to pick them. And they certainly seem to want their bodies to withstand almost anything that can be imposed on a body.
What do you mean by picking a body?
Well, the notion that you ought not to be constrained by your gender, that you ought not to be constrained by your reproductivity, that your familyed existence ought not to be too much of a burden, that your kinship responsibilities might be coded some other way than to be a weight on you. Whereas it's that very body that I have in mind. It's anybody's, everybody, anywhere. So it's, I think it's a less glitzy thing than the body has become for many people. It's much less of what I'd call it, what I see the other kind of body to be. It's much less of a toy body. I'm still the body of people who work under the double sort of biblical pain of work as hard work, but hard intelligent work, you know, in which you can't but be sensible of your body, and your body must be a kind of reasoning thing, otherwise you'll lose an arm or a leg. And not or worse still, your mate will lose an arm or a leg. So it's a kind of collective body. You have to be very much aware of what the other person's body is. This is comes together in wartime. Guys in a plane who have a very short combat life depend exactly on one another's reactions. Guys in a mine phase have to know exactly how each other are going to react. By now that might be considered a sort of sexist observation, but since women haven't been at the mine phase, they will have to learn those kinds of trust systems around their bodies in their work the way males have had to learn that.
Mm-hmm. This is a very distinctive emphasis in sociology, and your work has, perhaps it would be fair to describe it as working the border between sociology and philosophy. It's been very philosophically informed, but at the same time, in many cases, quite concrete social analysis. How do you understand the task of sociology as an intellectual discipline?
Well, I think it's the task really. It's had beautiful formulations, for example, by C. Wright Mills, when he says it's to fit private troubles to public issues. That's one of the, currently now, it suits very much the current organization of our political lives to have what are really important public issues discussed as though they were only private troubles, because there's a way in which private troubles are incalculable, they're implosive, they're never ending, and they're all absorbing. Whereas at the level of public issues, there's the possibility that you call for a paradigm change, that there's a certain amount of energy at one's disposal, and there's a sense of time, and this must happen rather than that. Whereas on the level of the private, it's also terribly important to each one. It fragments and it's divisive. So I would say I think of the sociologist as always trying to link the point where one finds oneself with a larger public or even cosmological level of inclusion. So that's always been the challenge, I think, to any scientist, though, is to sort of enter some very tiny pond of water and show that, in fact, there are universal structures, law-like structures of happenings going on there. And then in human behavior, since we can't experiment with one another, is to take a piece of given behavior and try to look at it in such a way that it relates to a number of other pieces of behavior.
Right. So that sociology plays this role in your understanding of making things that might be experienced as separate and as diffuse and as just your personal problem, and shows how it's related to the society as a whole.
Yeah, for example, I've always made my kids a little bit upset with me by talking at the television, running a permanent commentary on why what we're seeing is daft, or the other way around, like the African tribal chief who sends his sons to Oxford, but nevertheless, because he owns the TV, insists on directing the commentary, whether or not it's as good as one they might make. But the idea is to treat everything as some kind of interlocutor. I think that's one of the potential benefits of education, whereas so much of education is now being sucked into mass entertainment, and to the extent that that happens, why it makes for this mute appreciation of what's going on.
How would you analyze what happens socially when when private problems become perceived as public issues? What changes does this make in the social domain?
Well, the first thing it does is I think it creates a loss of perspective by seeming, curiously, to have focused perspective to what's going on in this life, these persons, these relationships, and by withholding all the things that in effect, that are actually framing that. So the frames are withheld in favor of an intimate setting or a mini narrative, which somehow you're supposed to get the transcending point of, or the universal reference for, or the socio-political implications of, but you don't, in fact. That just fizzles away, because to provide it is kind of boring. It takes long, and it's hard work, and it takes more than the personal.
Mm-hmm.
It takes more than the personal world can tolerate.
Yes. And so when it comes into the public realm, we tend to see movements oriented towards addressing certain social problems. How do you see the relationship of social movements to the perception of public problems?
I'm weak on social movements. I'm not sure that social movements go anywhere.
Why would that be?
Because I think the structural arrangements of power in our society are more served by the idea that things could change at the rate at which social movements need to have things changed, because they're composed of individuals whose own sense of time has been radically destroyed through personalization.
Mm-hmm.
That when you put since the movement's got to be made up of those persons, it tends to want and hope for, and indeed itself be taken as bringing about this or that, when in fact I think it's just mopping up energy, and almost from the time that it comes into being, it's subject to a sort of negentropic commentary that having started, it will live so long and it will die.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the personal is on that level. Our passions and our interests flare up, and they're gorgeous to have, and then they go down. So what comes in between is this awful, long, abstract, boring stuff. I think that only a few people have a calling for that. And if those people don't have heart, if they don't have the public heart and the historical sense to go with it, well, put the other way, they must have that. Otherwise, they fall between these two cracks.
Yes. How do you see societies as changing then, or do you? Do you see macroscopic, large-scale forces as being more important than, or more effective, shall we say, than movements?
Well, it's a sad thing, I think. I think the way human affairs have turned out is that we have rendered them so unequal that those few people that have most of the resources are always situated so as to set the terms, broadly speaking, of the next move.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that they absolutely know what it's going to be, but they're going to be, through the very resources they command, they're going to be able to second guess it better than anybody else. And so when things do shift, I mean, for example, it may not be that the elites understood the information society through and through, but they can certainly get the best advice about where it's going. And then what happens is two things happen. One is that they're situated to take the first run of profits out of a paradigm shift. In fact, they can claim that they own it, although in some sense they don't really own it because we're not that far-sighted. Mm-hmm. The second thing that they can do is for those who are not suited to the paradigm shift or the next stage of society shift, they can behave genocidally towards them. They can decide, well, we don't need you anymore.
So there's a panic now over being computer literate, because if one
Computer literate
isn't, you don't know what's going to happen to you.
And the dark night of exclusion.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not against computer literacy. The computer age should come, but what we need is some way of not treating that as a quasi-natural change, and we need then voices that will say, look, okay, it's here, but despite Bill Gates being this and so-and-so being the whiz kid of that, this is a collective change. And since we're all going to have to go through it, you guys should not be able to appropriate all there is to be made, nor should you be setting up a discourse that we already have in place around IQs and symbolic elites and computer illiterates to treat the persons on the outs of that as though they were dinosaurs.
Yes.
So I would say society goes through these massive changes. But they're not real changes. They're recoding the ground rule of inequality.
So if I understand you rightly, you're saying that because of the large scale and deeply entrenched social inequality, you're skeptical about the ability of social movements to really address this or to really be able to change it.
No, yes, I am skeptical, but I would say if they were to get their business done, they have to know enough about how the elite works. Now the elite isn't it hasn't so far been so solidary that once it's got its paradigm in place, it can't be gotten to soften it. So I would say in the shift from feudalism to capitalism, that paradigm shift was at first very severe, cruel, and it seemed even to the factory owners themselves that they wouldn't be able to get enough money unless they had kids and workers in the factories for a 16-hour day. And then when it changed to 14, they thought that would be the end of the world, and so on down to 8 and so on. Yeah. It just seemed like, although they knew the paradigm, they misread it as requiring greater levels of exploitation than it did. So they came to live with that. Now, they had to be members of their similar class who could say, look, we can soften this. And indeed, industrial capitalism was softened through Christian reform movements. So in that sense, movements, yes. And then eventually it was pulled together, though, in something that's not a movement, I think, namely the welfare state. Mm-hmm. So coming back to your business about the movements, I think nothing has a chance unless it has the welfare state behind it. That's the only thing whereby the elites will soften their version of what can be had, not had. Now, when I say the welfare state, again, I know that's being rearranged, but I think in terms of levels of analysis, unless it's a state level, then social movements will fritter, especially because they are often in place of class struggle. The idea is class doesn't go anywhere, so movements get going. Mm-hmm. But I think that the state, which is another way in which elites modify their behavior towards us.
Yes.
It's not a conspiratorial thing. You get elites to give, when they are being political, they will give you something back that they wouldn't dream of giving you the first time round that they make it. Yes. And then there gets to be some interaction. After all, labor conditions are not what they used to be and so on. But we need that loop that we call the state in order to be kinder and wiser with one another than we otherwise would be.
You know, in your description of these social conditions, to me, I hear a tension between, on the one hand, emphasis on inequality, vast inequality of wealth and power, and on the other hand, the argument that you're associating yourself with, that there have to be some form of commonality. There has to be some sense that we're all in this together, that the computer world of the future, for example, is something that we're all going to inhabit. How, in this world of inequality, on the one hand, how does the possibility of commonality emerge?
We can bring it back to that body we were talking about, the paradox of the way in which human beings behave so differently towards one another is that they can only do that on the basis of a first body which is roughly the same in every one of us.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when that body's new, as in a child, we all feel, well, now we'll be restarting this, and it's very hard to say that anyone's child is less lovely than another, should live any longer than anyone else's, or less longer, worse still, than anyone else's. So we have that first experience of a body politic. It's a body that if anyone has, everyone has. It's a body which is, when we think of it that way, is not a positional good. A positional good is one whose very enjoyment turns off somebody not having that to enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't think it's part of one's health that someone else is sick. It's part of one's parenthood that you know that there are other parents who can't feed their children. In fact, qua parents, we want exactly the same things for one another.
Is that true, John? I mean, it seems to me that inequality in class does play into this. One can have a kind of sympathy for somebody else and their child, but if we're in a competitive world where there's only so many university places, if this child doesn't get in, then my child has a better chance of getting in, no?
Yeah, I'm saying that one has to be able to say that the way we treat each other unequally turns off us having had, it's a paradox that we need, first of all, to be equal to become unequal. We need the same body in order for somebody to have a bigger appetite than us, or a right to eat more than others. Because of the nature of the we. Now, we try to break that we. For example, I might say, you're white and I'm black, and therefore you don't need this or that. But I cannot, when I say that you're black and I am white, I still need you to be a human being. You're not a black robot and I am a white human being. I may try to thinkify you as much as possible, but I cannot, and nor can you be. You might serve me up some of that stuff, but there'll be a double talk, there'll be a double life. And very often it's religion that cuts into that and says, well, okay, they're playing that game with us, but it'll be reversed. So the paradox of inequality is it's a game that only can be played by people of the same species.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very weird thing. Montaigne says that the thing about human beings is more difference between them than there is between human beings and animals.
There is this continual interplay between identity or commonality and difference in human social life. And we can speak here about the history of socialism as well as the history of sociology. There has been this attempt, which is key to the project of socialism, to find some basis for commonality. I've always been struck how in the history of socialist rhetoric that the term brothers and sisters always comes up. It is a familial metaphor.
Yes.
And it seems to me you're doing a very interesting thing by using a familial metaphor but shifting it to the child, to the next generation.
And the body, because I may seem not to have picked up on that commonality enough. As Marxists, we may not have done that because Marx, he put a great deal of emphasis on how the system lives off surplus value. It takes from its workers more than it gives to them.
Yes.
But what is the more that it takes? And it's that commonality. See, when you try to exploit a worker, he or she has to be smart enough to know they're being exploited.
Yes.
And they are. So depending on what their circumstances are, most workers will know how to cheat or work to rule, quite apart from union provisions for that. They will know that this is an unjust situation. They will know that their deafness or their intelligence or their honesty is being exploited. So I think capitalism then, it lives off moral capital. And that moral capital is the communal capital, because we all live off that same. I can't raise my children unless you raise yours.
Yes.
I can't breathe unless you can breathe. Now
said,
we know that the system renders some of that, scarce, but there's a sense in which it can never be so scarce as as part of its enjoyment is persons that don't have it at all, because then they're dead, and then it's committing murder at something another level.
You've said recently that there is no place for the child in liberal theory. What do you mean by that?
In terms of this paradox of the promise we hold out for one another and the way in which that promise is rendered scarce and unavailable to many people, I was looking for a strong place to formulate that in a society that's going off class, that's going off gender, it's going off race. I mean, it may talk a lot about that, but it's also, those discourses are wearing out. Now, I thought that surely people ought to be able to see that the way we harden up intragenerationally becomes a little less bearable if you think of it as an intergenerational practice, because whatever you might feel about once you're adult, what we one another, what we deserve for good and bad, because we are hardened up on one another by then.
Yeah.
In the name of children, we might soften the game. So when I started to, I thought, well, okay, because it's a cultural aporia then, is that lo and behold, we in fact, as you reminded me, we're as willing to make children's lives as hard as our own. So I started to look in the various literatures, and one of them was political liberal theory, and you find that in its founding notions of how society starts, it starts really with virgin males who fight one another over their property, which includes women and children. So in effect, the state of nature is a kind of homoerotic struggle over their women, who are the producers of their children. So the women and children are read out of the founding contract of a liberal society. So what I wanted to find was a strong contrastive notion to the covenant where children and women are read out. So I had the notion of a contract society. I came up with the notion of a covenant society, and there again I dug back to something I remembered reading in the university, Fustel de Coulanges, doesn't matter what it is, but I seem to remember that in there he had said that what the ancient family was, as I'd now put it, it was a machine for worshipping previous and future families. In other words, the family didn't own itself. It wasn't grounded in sexuality. It wasn't grounded in ownership notion of the body. It was grounded in piety. You are a family because someone else was a family, your grandparents, and because your children will become a family. So this modifies a very possessive sense of family that I think also, see, when the family becomes possessive, funny enough, and I suppose that's what Marx teaches, it's then you can have dispossessed families.
Yes.
That's the thing. In what we insultingly call primitive or worm-like segmental societies in sociology, no one owns the family. It's quite the other way around. Everyone is owned by it.
Yes. So you're looking at the child as the core of the family and trying to use this to resuscitate an ethic of solidarity or of caring in our society?
Would it be a new standard for an ethic? I think we have come some way. I think the welfare state did something about modifying class relations. I think since the 60s, our uses of Freudo-Marxism have done something to modify the relations between the sexes. That woman is not simply what it is that man thinks she is or ought to be or has to be. And indeed that man isn't properly himself unless he has a concept of woman as properly herself. So there's a kind of, not just a simple reversal of male-female positions, but really a fourfold structure of man, woman, woman, man interacting. So it's very complex. To make that work, it would be very complex, a complex grammar of the redefinition of male-female relationships. I would then, and we'll try to do that in terms of ethnicities and so on. but it looks as though the child is the last place. It's an unworked place. And you can see that just by simple little detail. Why it must be very hard for us to do something for children is precisely because it costs so little. As to say, UNICEF can point out to you that if for about 20% of the price of the coffee we had before we were doing this, you could give a child eyesight, or you might be able to give it a day's schooling. And no one does. So you have to think, well, God Almighty, what is that about? In other words, the sentimentalization of the problem in the appeal only works that much.
It might have to do with the body as well. If we actually saw that child right here in front of us now, it would be more difficult not to participate than an appeal through television, for example.
Well, we do have television appeals. I mean, a friend of mine's written a book about the whole matter of trying to raise money that way. It's very, very, it's like every other sociological thing. It's embedded in corporate careers and God knows what, and it's done for this reason and that reason. But I think just at the start from, Marx had to start from a what's a commodity. And I think we're on a frontier where you're best saying we've got to start with what is a child.
Let's stop there for a moment. We'll take a break. You've been emphasizing for us, John, how every new child is a new opportunity. And yet, once we have new children, we tend to put them into schools and institutions which are very much like the old schools and institutions. What do you see going on now as a trend in schooling?
Some very, very, very distressing things. I do believe that the school should be regarded as an absolute sanctuary, not an unreal place, not a play place, but the holiest of holies. It means that our teachers ought to be accorded great honor. That's a paradox that we treat our teachers as not the best members in the society.
Yes.
I mean, it's extraordinary. Even as university people, we are not that, we have a concern about what kind of school our kid goes to, but it's a kind of stratifying concern. We sentimentalize it, but it's still a stratifying concern. We really ought to be willing to teach. It's time that we taught our graduate students that a high school teaching is the place to go, not university teaching. Many a great philosopher like Hegel taught school. I taught high school when I was in graduate school. I still think of the university as school because of this, tying back to what we said earlier, this idea that it's a place where your world can keep opening up. Now, the concept of school there is what I'd call a civic concept. It's the idea that we should bring children to school as a matter of a reaffirmation of their commonality, not their averageness. Nothing to do with averaging them. It's that it should reaffirm their commonality, not be what it now is in danger of becoming more and more, namely a race, that they're being made to toe a line for a race that in many cases is over even before it starts.
Yes.
Maud Barlow and Heather Jane Robertson have a book here in Canada called Class Wars. And it's an important book because it shows now that the school system, has become another battlefield for corporate control. The matter now is that children are seen as fodder for the information industry.
Yes.
So their education is being reduced to information packaging. They are also seen as consumer fodder. So the corporations come in and want to get, in exchange for the packaging, in exchange for, say, giving the computers, they would like the information packages to come with it. At the same time, they want the school meals, the school drinks, and whatever. For example, in the US, that's a school food is a $4 billion
Wow.
market. So it's not the idea of just a purely romantic notion of the child's world. Children are always on the way to becoming adults, but it's the way they become. Are they going to be treated in school as nothing but information producers of various levels, and from the day one, their consumer lives deepened and deepened and deepened.
Yes. Because there is, after all, a school of social criticism that talks about schools as where children learn to be dominated, where they learn to sit and listen and never to talk, and
Yes.
this form of thing.
They do. They have to learn the tempo pacing and body controls and so on that are part of everyday life and part of the principal institutional settings that they're going to find themselves in later on. I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a question of whether every experience that they have is to servicing that.
Yes.
We were taught discipline so that it would release you for leisure, for scholar, for interest. It's another thing to be taught discipline and so on with the provision, under the proviso that you're never going to be anybody except someone who must, at the end of the day, be docile. Now, we have currently the new bell curve controversy, as it's called. It's the a curious restoration of the idea that we're divided 80-20, that 20% of us have brains, 80% don't. And when you combine that with managerialist discourses, you get the argument that, well, it's a waste of social resources to educate the 80%. You really only need to pass them through the school so that they're disciplined. And the other 20% are the obvious carriers of the culture, and the resources should go to them. Now that will be destructive of schools and universities. And it destroys the entire romance of education, and it will destroy the university. Now, of course, it will never be completely put in place. What it will do is to take the already rich places in the school system and the already rich, I mean culturally rich places in the school and university system and privatize them.
So you see a form of stronger form of streaming of coming about than has perhaps existed in the recent past.
I think that when an older civilization repeats or reintroduces an earlier form of itself, that's what you properly speak of as barbarism. So I see that as it's a barbarization of something that was fought and in some sense won. It's not that schools were always a paradise, because again, it's only with the Industrial Revolution that we send large numbers of people to school. And of course, at first we send them on the idea that they've got to be disciplined to their tasks. But we've softened that. School can be one of the most gorgeous things in your life. It can be one of the most sad things in your life too, but it's not necessarily only one thing.
Yes.
Now, school is being redefined as in effect, a place where children work. They're really there to work, and under strict notice that most of them are not likely to be of much use to the society.
So there's a sense of time wasting in schools, that you're being prepared for something that in fact you'll never see.
It's not time wasting, it's your capacity to deal with dead time that you are.
Mm-hmm.
The message is that you don't have enough brains. So your life is not going to be very much. and other people do have a lot of brains, and their life is going to be very rich. And the best you can do is live with that.
Well, where does this trend in schooling come from then? Because most of the people I've met who are teachers, and I don't know what your experience is, but they're generally a very dedicated group of people.
Yes, they are, and it's being imposed on them since school is split between teachers and administrators and politicians are the levels at which this managerialistic and quasi-biological discourse about brains, no brains can be injected. It couldn't be injected so easily if it weren't part of the current crisis of the welfare state. I think we have to understand that the schools are part of the welfare state.
What's the current crisis of the welfare state?
The current crisis of the welfare state is that as the global elite go into globalizing themselves, they're in about the same state of panic as the 19th century factory capitalists were about whether or not they could afford more than the little they were willing to give. So they stripped, just as they stripped the kind of feudal poor law system, charity system, and put in its place the poorhouse and criminalized poverty. In this present stage, the greedy globalists think they can't afford a liberal, democratic, and civic society. They can't afford opera. They can't afford ballet. In a sense, they have a terrible anal complex, you would say, that they're not sure now that they can afford any of the civic productions of sport on every level except the professional level, of music that comes out of anywhere and everywhere. They think that they can have it all in one efficient, relatively costless place, upon which they will no less make huge profits.
Right.
And they think the world will, that's how the world should go. Now we have to hope that that will break down. We have to just hope and push wherever there's a chance to make it break down. So schools are part of that. The schools are not outside of the problem of health, and although we say health education and employment, we really do need to realize that the schools are a central part of that. We've got a debate going about post-secondary education. Now, again, that's a debate because in some sense, life is over when you're adult. So people will actually listen to discourses about whether they're expendable or not. So do we have too much, or is it too costly to have the university system? So it has to be seen as all part. I mean, the universities come out of the schools come out of the nursery schools, and it must all be seen as one complex, and it must all be seen as what the welfare state is about, not what it costs.
Yes.
That much, really.
You see the pressure then for dismantling civic culture. The pressure comes from the managers of globalizing economic interests. On the other hand, there are other groups of people like teachers and many others in the society whose interests are really elsewhere. And why do you think that the globalizing economic interests have been so successful in recent times in convincing other people, the person in the street, me and you, about their agenda? Finance capitalism has always had a kind of relatively high degree of autonomy in capitalist society. That's part of it. Although I really think there's nothing as desperate in the world as a person with a lot of money, because their money is worthless. Yeah, that may seem crazy, but you can see how worthless it is when you see that a Van Gogh is bought for $20 million. It isn't worth $20 million. It's that the poor man or syndicate or whomever has $100 million that are just $100 million. So it's got to find something to put it into. So it puts it into art, so on. Now, the more it destroys the local production of art, assigns it to welfare, and then finally withdraws the welfare, the more money it's going to have to put into its Van Goghs, or its antiques, or whatever. So there's a sense in which the whole matter of the national deficit is bogus, because as long as the national deficit commands a price, it can't be a problem. So long as it
has
excuse me?
a price, in the sense that someone will buy the national debt. Why will they buy it? Because they've got so much money that they otherwise wouldn't make any money. So if someone says, well, okay, you buy our debt and we'll pay you 9% or 17%, instead of them earning nothing or 1 or 2, in capitalist logic, there can't really be a deficit problem. This notion, well, we could go and buy somebody else's deficit, that's not true. If you're going to buy the deficit of some war, Chechnya or Russia or something, it's not nearly as good a thing to buy as the debt of Canada. Now, why does the other thing that's I think a feature of global capitalism is that it has concentrated the media. It owns the media through which we hear, don't hear, and how we do hear, and for as long as we hear or don't hear about this and that. So globalism's self-understanding gets all the news.
Yes.
And thereby, and with it, of course, it's misunderstandings. And it's so powerful and so immediate that it impoverishes every other way of speaking about it. It's very difficult to speak about it otherwise than it speaks about itself.
Yes. So on the one hand, we have no money for culture in the sense of teaching people to appreciate culture, and for schools and for art and for things that might allow people to understand their world better. On the one hand, there's no money for that. That's all just spending, as it's called. On the other hand, there are terrific global culture industries, television, films, and so forth, which are making terrific amounts of money out of culture. And in the second one, of course, the worldview, the agenda of the corporate global economy is pervasive.
Yes.
We don't get many alternative ideas. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, but what I want to try to say underneath that is that even capitalists sometimes know and sometimes don't know that money is a fiction. Money is a fiction. That means it can be a political fiction. That is to say, when Britain and when Canada and when the US decided that they couldn't have millions of people unemployed and so on, they went in for the welfare state or the New Deal. Yes. And they made the money that made those institutions work, that made the money work. If somebody had come along in the early days, all sorts of pieces of the information age were available, but they didn't become institutional. They looked pure fictions. Well, that won't work. We won't make enough money on that. That's crazy to say that one day everybody will own a computer. Mm-hmm. But once that fiction becomes a corporately backed fiction, it's a reality, right? So it's money rides like that. The Japanese, for example, they got a hold of that and gave it a real estate spin. We suffered from the way, for a while, real estate tells us we're all wealthier than we are.
Yes. Yeah.
But we are when we are. And we're not when we're not. So that the fictionality is compatible with, that you're rich and that you're poor. But so when you're going to go from one to the other, it's the same thing that circulates it. So the welfare state is caught up in that fiction. So what will happen, I think, is that capital theory, it's not a pure invention. Capital theory already has a version of itself called human capital theory, which is the recognition that, after all, capitalism isn't driven so much by the machines as by the brains that go into them and the brains that use them. So that so labor is actually quite a good, intelligent, etc. Labor is a very good thing to have. So then there will be reinvestments in schools and education and so on. That's in fact to some extent going on, but we don't control yet the discourse that's saying how that reinvestment should go.
Yes.
And supposing you had said 20 years ago that we're going to put a computer at every desk in the schools and the universities, we can never afford that.
Yes.
Now, in cutback, we can afford that. Why? Because it's coming in the name of a different fiction.
Yes, true indeed. There's money for computers, but there's no money for teachers anymore.
Yeah.
Well, underlying a number of the things that you've been arguing to me is the notion that you can't understand a specific phenomenon without understanding the general social forces that are at play in making it maybe too strong, but influencing things in one direction or another. So perhaps I can ask you directly now, how do you characterize this contemporary society we live in? Do you call it a capitalist society, an industrial society? Or how do you characterize it? Why do you use the terms that you use?
I call it duty-free capitalism. That's what I call it. What's peculiar about the current state of capitalism is that it imagines it need not pay its civic debts. And it's, in the name of that, it's willing to go to societies that have never had the concept of civic debt in order to scoop up 50 cents an hour, $2 a day labor, women and children, as deeply into the exploitation of women and children, where human rights are very, very low, in order to treat that kind of fourth world as an image of what global capitalism ought to enjoy. So I think its nose needs to be rubbed in to that, because I suppose in the end one is saying that you have to remind capitalists that they have some residual conscience.
This sounds like a very difficult task, right? You're talking about a group of managers of capital who are willing to go to places where there are no labor laws, no environmental laws, and at the same time are putting a pressure on our society to dismantle those safeguards that we have had in the recent past.
They talk that up, but they still invest in places like Canada, don't they? And they still invest in the US, and they still invest in the UK, they still invest in Europe, because in the end it's the external economy, the way things knit together. It comes back to that original notion of rent. Capitalism works better where everything is not thoroughly capitalized.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, when it goes to the third world, or it goes into Russia, what is it? It looks like the perfect place for capitalism to get going, but in fact, it's such a wild west. The language of contract doesn't really exist, property doesn't exist, and they rush off and sign all these things, but there's no real grammar for those notions. So there's a lot of that stuff won't work out. What you'll get is petit rentier capitalism, people selling off the cultural legacy in the name of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk like that, I'm very conscious that that complexity of the issues you're talking about means that this very exercise, where some one person seems to have an analysis of it, is grossly misleading. I think in today's intellectual world, all you can know is how little you know in virtue of how much you know.
Mm-hmm.
And that there are people who are statisticians, economists, historians, lawyers, political scientists. All of them have to have some piece of it. Unless you know something about the best way you can hope to know from them, you simply cannot have an idea of what's going on.
In your analysis of what you call duty-free capitalism, you do see then some space still for social action. You don't want to say that the global economic system is so strong there's no space for movement.
No, I think to the extent that globalization is reported in the media as it is, it's reported at media pace. It has things happening faster than they can, and it tends to extrapolate. Journalistic accounts of that tend to extrapolate, and the current fashion of being fashionable among scholars gives it more of a spin. So I think, put it that way, globalism is a spin word. Mm-hmm. It doesn't go that fast. The taking apart of the welfare state is another kind of spin. If it really were taken apart, we would probably have something like civil war.
Yes.
Or if we didn't want to have civil war, we would need, if you could have it without having civil war, you'd need genocide. You would have to simply tell a lot of people to die. I mean, right now we would have to take most of the maritime and Atlantic provinces and just erase them. I mean, they've got too high levels of unemployment. We don't want to use them. Or we've got to park them in terms of the welfare state until we can get the thing figured out.
Yes. the task then is to pressure, you would suggest that any kind of capitalism as a social system requires some degree of agreement, as it were, to proceed. And the task is then to pressure them to recognize their civic duty. Is this recognition, how might it happen? Do you see, for example, the public service strikes in Ontario now as a means of pressuring for the recognition of a civic duty?
Yes, I think they are. They are, and they are saying, as Canadian people do when polled, they're saying we want the welfare state. We also think this way we don't want certain things. We have reached a limit of tolerance. I think the trouble for strikes generally in the 20th century is that they happen, that the semiotics of them are wrong. They happen outdoors, and the gross vulgarity of bodies angrily making their point, which they properly should be making, doesn't fit with the facelessness and the rational grammars of the rest of the society, so that in a way they look like they are throwbacks, when what is the problem is that they have a real central moral point that I think they'd be better off making inside the hotels. But maybe not in hotels. Maybe the fact is that the settings is wrong. There's something about the setting, and then there's something why the unions, when they strike and so on, why they don't have their own media amazes me, because the way they are presented in the media is always to their disadvantage.
Yes.
Always to their disadvantage.
Well, we see the same phenomenon too in the case of native land claims, for example. And we've seen two different strategies here in British Columbia. We've had, on the one hand, some roadblocks and some militant tactics, and on the other hand, the Nisga'a land claim, which has recently been, is in the process of being agreed with by the current government. So we see two different kinds of strategies.
Yeah, the danger there is, you see, you're playing into the hands of the managerial sector or the political bosses by engaging in behavior which potentially will criminalize you. That's always been a way to deal with labor, that if it can be caught breaking some simple law of not walking, breaking the law that thou shalt not walk on the grass, then it falls into a less serious business than the business it has.
Yes.
So therefore its business has to be conducted in wherever is a more, that minimizes those eventualities.
Yes, I mean, organized labor to some extent walks the very same difficult line that teachers walk. On the one hand, there are some repressive aspects of signing agreements with the system and agreeing to go along and so forth. Self-policing, you might call it. On the other hand, it does open up a space for a more humane pay rates, for better working conditions, for better teaching conditions.
Yes.
It's a difficult trade-off, that one.
Yes. I think nothing looks worse, just looks worse, than teachers outside their own schools carrying badly written signs, sometimes misspelled, and coffee cups, than, say, bringing the people they're bargaining with into the school to bargain, where the kids are. You see.
Make them give their reasons to the children, in other words, as to why there's no money for education.
Let them see that. That here's what. But at the end of the day, sort of like Borden's cow, it's that, you know, at the end of the day, this is what we do. It's these kids in these rooms with this and that. Whereas when they go outside, and just for the sake of looking like workers, and then it's a curious move. You've gone out of your workplace to fight to get back into it.
This is true, but it surely it comes from, and this is again an old Marxist point, but it still seems true to me at least, that it's because the workplace doesn't belong to them. And to some extent, perhaps one thing that the welfare state did was to give them some right over their workplace,
but it would be interesting,
which they're now losing again.
You could say, well, okay, we'll reenact that the workplace doesn't belong to us by standing outside of it and saying we're not going to go back in there unless you change the rules. Or you could say it does belong to us.
Yes.
And this is how it belongs to us, and we're staying in here until you change that. It seems to me there's a potential for claiming it better from the inside. In a way, the students were better at that. When the students sat in, I think they get further than when they sat out.
That would be called politicizing the classroom, politicizing education.
Yes. And it has its, it's a two-edged sword. I think at the level of the university, faculty have probably lost vis-a-vis the students from strikes. They're not sure about our moral purpose.
Yes. Well, and sometimes I think we're not sure about our moral purpose either.
I suppose if we said, well, clearer and said we have two purposes, one is moral and one is political, they overlap, but at the end of the day, they're not quite the same thing.
Yes. Well, for example, in the university, I mean, we are also workers, and in the sense we have a right to defend our working conditions and so forth, as telephone operators or any other group of people have that right. But the moral purpose of preserving education is somewhat distinct from that. I think we have that purpose too.
Yes, well, it's in also, there's a way in which if what we're doing is worthwhile, we can't know exactly what we're doing. And we have to leave a margin for that.
Yes.
See, the one thing a businessman will respect is something that he really doesn't understand.
So you think we should make what we do very difficult to understand?
Yeah, at the end of the day, because it's just, why would they buy a Van Gogh? Precisely because they haven't got the slightest idea what it is. Well, they know the price of it, you understand, but they don't have the slightest idea of how it is Van Gogh got himself in the state to produce those paintings.
This is true.
And it's before that they kneel. And they give all their useless money for one of those. It's the mystery of it. That beats them absolutely. And I think in the university and the school system and the medical system, there's that sacred thing at the bottom of every one of those things. That professionals perhaps have not been the best, they have not been the best guardians of that flame. But I think in a way that would be their ultimate thing. That they shouldn't. Because in the language of strikes, what will happen, if you go the language of strike, you put out the flame. You don't teach that day. You don't operate that day. You let some poor bugger hang instead of not hang, or what. That's not it. You should operate that day, teach that day.
Yeah.
Then they're up against something. They really are then. So that whole world of rational utilitarian thing suddenly meets a limit. Now, it's not a Martian limit. I mean, we in capitalists, we're not different beings, otherwise all the talk's totally daft. We just might as well get out the ray guns then. You can't be talking unless, on the other end of it, there's one like yourself. However, whatever the distance, it's not the absolute distance.
And this perhaps brings us full circle to where we started, where I started asking you about the task of sociology. You see this larger picture, or trying to bring into being a form of speaking that addresses the other as another, as part of the task of sociology?
Yeah, and it's in danger nowadays because of what I would call the implosion of alienation. We're in danger of talking as though a businessman and a politician and a layman were totally different kinds of people, that men are totally different kinds of people from women, and kids are totally different from adults, and each of the professions is totally different. And then we try to pull it all back into the abstract language of persons who are sort of anonymous things making claims, when if we accept that we overlap, it's within that overlap that we can be characters, and then soul, so another language of relatedness and difference than the one we're mounting now, which is often, I think, runs the risks of what I'd call race, gender, and class alienism, that we're celebrating the ways in which we don't and cannot understand and overlap. But really, that can only be viable if we imagine that we're all addressing some super transcendental thing, usually what's left of the state, to legalize and bind it together.
Well, thank you, John O'Neill, for a very interesting exploration of contemporary issues, and social analysis.
Well, thank you, Ian.
Okay.
No, they mustn't get that. Daft over bit. The daft. Is there anybody here?